Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Sean Connolly. He's the TIC Program Manager at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, part of Homeland Security, and Brigadier General Chad Radegui. He's Director of Cyberspace and Information Dominance at the Headquarters Air Combat Command for the U.S. Air Force. It's good to have you both on. And let's get right into it. The world has changed a lot. Here we are more than 6 months into a pandemic that has forced agencies, both military and civilian, into this mass telework. And so cybersecurity is really something I think agencies are still exploring. They've done a pretty good job of buttoning things up so far. So maybe if you would, and Sean, we'll start with you, just tell us how the approach has changed as a result of the change in the workforce makeup, the advent of commercial clouds was coming on strong then, and also maybe some of the advice you're giving agencies from the CISA standpoint.
Sure. Thank you for having me on, Tom. So that current surge in telework that you talked about, right? As the workforce was being dispersed and as the networks themselves are being dispersed, we had the old TIC-2 model, which was that traditional castle and moat, that network perimeter that everyone defended. But when we released our guidance, our draft guidance in December, and then when the telework surge happened, we heard very quickly from agencies they needed new guidance coming out pretty quickly to support the requirements they were hearing from their mission owners and their users. So as the guidance was being updated and we released an interim guidance in April, it really reflected what OMB was hearing, GSA was hearing, we were hearing from the agencies themselves. And it was how that old model where it was the fixed assets, the desktops on the network lands, and now where it was more unfixed, if you will, assets, the mobile, the tablets and stuff on someone's home network or some Wi-Fi somewhere. And then also how the cyber attack themselves, what the adversaries were doing was changing. Before under TIC-2 was about protecting assets, maybe the TIC, the DMZ, having protecting the DNS server at the DMZ or the email server. Really that changed. Now you're starting to see where the adversary is setting up a fake social networking profile, trying to gain trust with the user. They're trying to scan cloud services to see something that's misconfigured. And so the landscape has changed, the threat has changed. And so with that, the guidance that we came out with reflected that. At the same time, you're seeing other guidance come out. Both FBI and CISA in partnership came out with an advisory in August talking about some of the new threats coming out. So the adversary has shifted their tactics. And so we've moved past that traditional network perimeter from before. So in April, I mentioned that draft guidance. We released the telework guidance. It helps agencies as they want to start moving possibly toward a micro-segmentation or even toward a zero trust environment. Zero trust, as everyone recognizes, where you don't assume trust. Trust has to be built, reestablished all the time. So those type of environments are what we're trying to move and support moving forward.
Okay, and General Radegui, I mean, the Air Force and the military has always had a defense in-depth approach to the networks that it operates, and there's levels of secret and top secret and open networks. But how have things changed with so many people teleworking and the military also moving to less reliance on its own data centers?
Tom, thank you for the question, and it's my pleasure to join this great panel and discussion. I think, as you alluded to, Tom, we have made very good strides in our United States Air Force to get after the future network. Some of that was a journey that we've been on for a little while. There was recognition, even pre-COVID, that our legacy network that we were operating at multiple different layers and levels was under-resourced. We also recognized that to move forward, we were not postured to take advantage of some of the IT trends that are out there, whether it's artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum, 5G technologies. We were just not postured for that. What we discovered very quickly in the response to COVID and the mass teleworking requirements that were thrust upon us is that we needed to adjust. And so we recognized that the network attack surface exponentially grew overnight. And so as a cybersecurity professional, as one that is talking to our cybersecurity professionals on a daily basis and making sure that they're protecting our Air Force network, that was a big concern for us. So if nothing more, we have had a recommitment to building out the future network. And so we start thinking in terms of a closer alignment with industry. This is some work that we've been doing on an as a service model. We have taken a renewed focus on recognizing the sophisticated cyber threats that are out there, some of those that Sean mentioned, and how do we protect our weapon systems. There has been a renewed emphasis on interconnectivity. So you start hearing about some of the things that Department of Defense is doing from a joint all-domain command and control. This is really about a network of sensors that are all connected with one another, resiliency built in, the movement of data back and forth for everyone to see and make decisions based on. And then finally, there's been a renewed focus on expeditionary communications environment. So as you read the National Defense Strategy and you recognize the near-peer adversary threats that are out there, it requires a different model. And so we've been thinking about how do we employ agile combat employment in the future. And our recognition has been that the zero trust principles that Sean did a nice job of laying out, that is the future. Specifically, as we responded to the COVID response, we always had strong endpoint security strategy in place. What we recognized immediately, though, was that we were not postured to account for that increased network attack surface. And so, if anything, the lesson that we have learned from the COVID response has been the power of relationships. And we have a more focused group right now than we've ever had, between the acquisition professionals, our policy professionals, our operators at 16th Air Force, and then our organized, train, and equip headquarters functions. That relationship between those vast different groups all coming together and thinking about the IT that we need for the future has been our most powerful lesson learned coming out of COVID.
Okay, excellent. And I want to follow up a little bit on this zero trust idea that you both mentioned, that this is where government seems to be headed in an architectural standpoint. To be able to trust, though, requires data. And at one time, all you needed, if the username and the password matched, that constituted trust. So what kinds of information are needed in this day and age of zero trust, and what kinds of sources do you look at to establish the environment such that you can establish trust in a trustworthy way, I guess? Sean?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. There's that algorithm I think you're alluding to. What do you need to do to establish and reestablish that trust? And you hit the nail on the head, Tom, when you talked about identity access management. That's where it all starts, is the identity of the user, the application itself. And then you also want to enrich that in different ways. You have the access controls allowing the user, the data, the sessions themselves to be able to access. And before in the TIC2 model, that castle and moat, everything had to be funneled through those finite access points for it to enforce that trust. But now with cloud and the way security is scaled out, now you can move those policies closer to the data itself, closer to the client itself. So the scale has changed, the scale of the telemetry coming to you, and the amount of data, the variety of data that's available. All that's greatly changed in the last few years. So the algorithm has all that type of different elements we just talked about. Also, the network analysis itself is still critically important. The telemetry coming off of the different cloud services that you may be accessing, the different APIs is also important. And then the different intel feeds, it's another great way to be able to be aware and establish that trust itself. So all those different elements together build up that algorithm. And it's key to understand that it's a cycle now. It's not just a one-time establish of the trust. It's a continual reestablishment of that trust throughout the whole session itself.
And you mentioned intel feeds. What do you mean by that?
Sure, intel feeds. Both commercial and private feeds that can come that have different tactics and protocols, the ports, the address, the IP addresses of the adversaries. You can enrich your access controls with that type of telemetry, those intel feeds. So when the policy enforcement point is making decisions, they can look at what we know on the adversaries, what the commercial products know on the adversaries, and decide, okay, is this a trusted user, or does this have some of the different ways that an adversary will be trying to establish trust also?
So in other words, the items needed to establish trust have increased by quite a number. And if any one of them doesn't work, say everything is correct about the location and so on, and seeming other factors of trust of this individual trying to log on, say, to a system, if the Intel feed shows, but yeah, but that IP address is something on a
Right.
blacklist, then forget it.
Sure. Was this domain just recently stood up? What is this coming from an Eastern European country? Was this never was this IP address never seen before? All elements you can use to establish that algorithm. I forget if it's through the Act I Act white papers that come out on zero trust. Also, just full disclosure, my name's I'm one of the authors of the NIST zero trust paper that came out. I forget where it was, but I think one of them talked about how there's now well over 100 different elements you can use to build the algorithm out.
Okay, and is that the same approach in the Air Force, pretty much, General Radke? I mean, do you see that the enrichment of trust by data?
By data, the ingestion of large amounts of data and then making decision qualities based on that is absolutely true. And so I agree with what Sean said. You know, we have a number of endpoint security systems and technologies and products that are out there that are all feeding a big data platform that we're monitoring. We have verification on the DISA STIGs that are in place, and are we compliant with those individual things? And then, as Sean mentioned, the threat intel, we're getting vast amounts of reporting, not only internal to the federal government, but our commercial partners as well. The open source reporting that is out there, that is feeding our cybersecurity professionals and allowing them to make informed decisions. I think the important point, though, Tom, is that this is a kind of a snapshot of where we are today, and there is very much a recognition that this is not good enough as we move forward. And so that's what I think the zero trust future, this zero trust strategy is all about. It's thinking about the old perimeter security, and it's now thinking about how do you protect the data, whether that's in transit or whether that's at rest. We start using some principles, and Sean referenced some of these. We're moving quickly from network location to identity. We're moving from domain credentials to device compliance. We're now thinking in terms of trusting implicitly versus now you have to prove that you are trustworthy. We're moving from, hey, you have full access, kind of that castle and moat approach. You have full access to now you have limited access based on what you need and only based on your proven trustworthiness. So these are some of the things that we're building in to our DoD frameworks as we're moving forward.
And just briefly, I guess it's fair to say too that all this has to happen at wire speed too. This types of automated decision making.
Our adversaries are now so quick in the way that they're making decisions. It is decision speed. It is there is an urgency to stay ahead of the decision space so that we can stay one step ahead of our adversary. Absolutely.
Okay, on that note, we'll take a short break. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This discussion is Trust Who Your Data Tells You to Trust, sponsored by Splunk here on Federal News Network.